All right, about half of the Messianics are going to love me for this, and half are going to hate me, or they're both going to hate me because I'm going to be poisoning your position by agreeing with it. Okay, so in Matthew 23, I want to talk about this whole idea of the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, and therefore do whatever they say because they sit in Moses' seat, right? What does that mean? Let's set aside the whole like Nehemiah Gordon thing where there's this medieval Hebrew Matthew manuscript, and it's actually there's 6 of them, and like 2 out of the 6 have his reading. It's just textually too absurd. We can't even go there. But what does it mean from the majority? You know, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, therefore do what they tell you. What does that mean? What is it talking about? You'll often get this idea, not just from Hebrew roots types, but also from some Protestants, that this is not referring to actual judicial authority on the part of the Pharisees, but that it's only referring to when they're sitting in Moses' seat, which means reading the book of Moses. And they'll even point out that we have these seats in first century synagogues. But that's simply not true. In synagogues today, when the Torah is read, it's read standing up, and then the sermon is given sitting down in the seat. And so the sitting down refers to the interpretation in the sermon. Now, how do we know that this is true? Well, we have this wonderful Second Temple Jewish document called the Gospel of Luke. And in Luke chapter 4, we get a very clear layout of what happens in a synagogue service in the first century. Because Jesus comes into a synagogue and in Nazareth, and in verse 16, and he went to the synagogue as his custom was on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And then he reads the passage. And then in verse 20, and he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So we know that the first century practice was the same as the modern practice. You read the Torah standing up, you interpret it sitting down. So what he's saying is the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They have interpretive authority. They can tell you what Moses means. Okay? What he goes on and says is, don't do what they do. Do what they say, not what they do, because they don't practice what they preach. Okay, that's his criticism of the scribes and Pharisees, not of their preaching. So he does say that they have this authority. They have interpretive authority. That's very clear. And in fact, it's very clear in the text because he goes on and affirms things that they'll tell you. He says He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy." And then he says, "These you also ought to have done without neglecting the other." So he says, tithing mint and dill and cumin, which is not in the Torah, you should be doing, but you neglected other things that you should be doing as well. Continued in part 2.